as we come towards the end of this series on Orthodox Islam, tonight we want to begin our discussion with first talking about whether Islam has an interest and an opinion in how Muslims should govern themselves, or whether Islam is merely faith for the individual. The actions that we have seen so far from the past caliphs, in, for example, how immediately after the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ, they changed some of his policies and some of the rules within Sharia. And then in the later caliphs, the Umayyad and Abbasids, in how they lived a life contrary to the life of the Prophet ﷺ in building palaces and living like kings, suggests that Muslims may have been fooled into having this belief and idea that religion was a personal matter and it was a private matter. The government of all these different periods was seen as supporting Islam and upholding its values by building mosques and by providing social services, but in reality Muslims and Islam was used for their own intentions and growth. It was used, for example, to justify invading other lands in the name of jihad in order to gain access to more natural resources in those other lands and to collect taxes from the peoples of those other lands. And the wealth then became something that was personal to them, and they became royal families where they decided how that wealth of the ummah would be spent and where it would be spent and for what purposes. Now, this continued on, and we see this to this day in a lot of dynasties that exist in the Middle East, which on one hand present themselves as the guardians and the custodians of Islam and its holy sites, but on the other hand use the wealth of the land as their personal wealth, and they are the royal family above everyone else. In the early dynasties, because there was no oil, therefore they relied on these resources and land invasions and so on to collect taxes and so on for their wealth. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922 and the Khilafat came to an end officially in 1924, a few years after, in 1938, oil was discovered in what is today Saudi Arabia. It was first discovered in an area called Dammam, that is today's Dhahran. And this now became the black gold, and so it merely shifted from the Turks having that sort of a control over Muslims to now others in the Middle East, in the name of Saudi Arabia, for example, having access to this enormous amount of wealth, and now taking that wealth to put themselves in a position where they now speak on behalf of Islam, even though their ideology represents a very small minority of Muslims. What we have tried to show in all these previous nights is that the reason why Islam spread so quickly in the world is because Islam was not taught and spread as a religion for the individual. It was not taught as a faith for one individual who seeks higher realization, but rather it was spread as a religion for the community. Salvation was not being offered as an individual salvation, but as a communal salvation. And there are many, unfortunately, today as well amongst the Muslims who still believe that Islam has nothing to do with politics, and there is a complete separation of, so to speak, church and state, and that these two have nothing to do with each other. As an example, the first Prime Minister of Iran after the revolution of Iran in 1979, Mahdi Bazargan, he was an individual who held this opinion that the purpose of the mission of all the prophets was to teach people about the afterlife, to teach people how to become more spiritual, and to teach people about God. But Islam was never meant to teach people how to govern themselves and how to manage their own affairs. And so it was not necessary for people to turn to the Quran to discover, for example, the laws of science or how to govern themselves or politics or economics and all such matters. For all such things, he argued that Muslims, just like non-Muslims, should rely on what he called collective reason. And then this idea has now been promoted further by individuals like Dr. Surush and others that you may have heard from. But what we are arguing is that the idea that Islam was meant to inspire only the individual for higher spirituality, but never to define the framework of governance in a political system, is against the obvious reading of the Quran. Now, I want to share some evidence of this from the Quran. First of all, it is naive to believe that spirituality can be attained without giving any attention to how one governs oneself in this world and without any religious regulation. Let us take a very simple example. Supposing we run a government and a society, and because of what people want, our collective reason determines that our society, as a democratic one where we use collective reason, should allow the existence of casinos and nightclubs and other such places, because this promotes freedom, this promotes human rights, and this is good for job growth and economy. Now, can we still believe that this decision that was the result of collective reason will not have any impact on the spiritual growth of the individuals who live in such a society? So we begin to see that collective reasons will make decisions based on the physical needs of people without paying attention to the spiritual need, but there is an inextricable connection between the two. Furthermore, if religion is personal and spiritual growth is only for the individual and not for the society and the community, then why does Islam prohibit monasticism? If you look at, for example, chapter 57, verse 27, there is a very clear condemnation of rahbaniyya and what the Christians did in setting up monasteries where people who sought higher forms of realization and spirituality isolated them from themselves from society to seek this spirituality. Islam condemns that. Why does Islam insist that there is greater reward when you engage in acts of worship in a communal basis, as a community? Why is there more thawab to pray salat in jama'at, when the fact of the matter is you can concentrate more and focus more if you pray alone at home? Why is there such emphasis on Hajj, for example? Why does Islam talk about the obligation to fulfill things that fulfill social needs, like paying the mandatory zakat, for example, or prohibiting usury, for example, riba? You can begin to see that Islam is not just interested in the individual's soul and spirituality, but in setting up a society and a community that is spiritual, because it is only in that atmosphere that individuals and families can be fostered to be more spiritual. And that is the success of Islam thus far, that it calls for salvation at a communal basis and not at an individual basis. Verse 59, Allah does not simply ask the faithful to obey Allah and His Prophet. He says, "Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum." Obey Allah and obey His Messenger, and obey the one vested with authority amongst you. Right here then we see that Allah wants someone to be obeyed even after the Prophet. In chapter 5, verse 55, where he talks about who is your guardian, "Innama waliyukumullah," your guardian is Allah and your guardian is the Rasul, and then there is a description of who your guardian is, the one who establishes prayer, the one who gives zakat while he is in ruku. So again, once more we see that the idea of wilaya and wali is being extended beyond Allah and His Messenger. And therefore the argument that the Prophet was only a messenger and he came and revealed and delivered a message and went away, and now Muslims have to use their collective reason, does not seem to agree with the Quran thus far. It seems to be calling for some sort of a guardian. The Quran also doesn't just guide in matters of hereafter and spirituality. In Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 213, it says that this Quran has been revealed as well that it may judge between the people in matters concerning which they differ. لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ فِي مَا اخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ. So now the Quran is also being used to settle disputes and discord between people. So again we see it is not individual. And then in Surah Al-Hadid, again chapter 57 verse 25, Allah says that He sent apostles, He sent messengers, He sent Rusul, and with them He sent the book and the balance, the mizan, so that mankind may maintain justice. لِيَحْكُمَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. Now what you should note here is that it is not the Rusul who are supposed to maintain justice. He sent the messengers with the book and the balance so that people may establish justice. So people are now being asked to establish a society that is just. And then again we see that if Allah had no opinion in how people govern themselves, then He wouldn't, for example, have said in chapter 2 verse 205, condemning those who have authority and are unjust. He says those who, if they were to take authority, they would cause corruption in the land and they would ruin the crop and the stock, and Allah does not like corruption. He's talking about people who, if they were given authority, they would cause fasad on the earth. So you begin to see that there is this constant theme again and again. Those who have faith are being told that be maintainers of justice. Kunu qawwamina bil qist. Even if it is against your own selves. Walau ala anfusikum. This is again in chapter 4 verse 135. And then I mentioned this verse before in one of the previous nights in Surah Al-Ma'idah chapter 5 verse 8, where Allah says, وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تَعْدِلُوا اِعْدِلُوا هِيَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Do not let your hatred for other people drive you to become unjust. Be just always. That is closer to being God-weary. So there is this constant thing about justice. And then finally in chapter 11 verse 85, Allah says, observe fully the measure and the balance with justice, and do not cheat people of their goods, and do not act wickedly on the earth, causing corruption. So we begin to see that the Quran now ties the individual salvation and success in the afterlife directly with upholding just and God-conscious society on the earth. And that is impossible without acknowledging that there is some sense of Islamic politics, some sense of Islamic government, some idea of Islamic sociology, Islamic economics. And it is not merely faith and practice and worship and an individual salvation. Now, it is true that most of the verses of the Quran are not about laws, and most of the verses of the Quran talk about spirituality and the afterlife and calling towards God. And the fuqaha tell us that there is about 500 ayats of Quran that are called ayatul ahkam, verses on the laws and the sharia. And in a Quran that is over 6,000 plus verses, this is a small number. But this number as well is still very supportive and significant in suggesting that there is sociopolitics and science in the Quran, and that Islam does care and does have an opinion about this. Now, we have mentioned last night that where Muslims failed was in striking a balance between one extreme and the other extreme, between reforming Islam and reviving Islam, between that, so to speak, Mu'tazili leaning and Ash'ari leaning, between wanting change in a very liberal manner and modernity versus being very strict and literal in interpretation of the Quran. And the solution lies in between, in trying to extract and plumb and mine from the Quran principles on whose basis a society can be established that can still adopt modern ideas without being disloyal to the values of Islam and the Sharia. So for example, if we were discussing in modern times the establishment of a government, and we were trying to decide, should this government adopt democracy or communism or socialism, or should it be a theocracy and a religious and an Islamic republic and so on, we can still talk about having some sort of collective reason that will argue and say, for example, in a country like Iraq, the majority are not Shia, so you can't potentially set it up as you set it up in Iran. Or in another country, Muslims are, for example, a minority, so you can't set it up in that sense as well. So that collective reason of how should we govern ourselves can still be there. But along with that, there could still be this idea that we don't jeopardize the principles and the primary mission of the prophets who came, because their primary aim was for humanity to attain salvation. And as we have said, Islam's mode of trying to give human salvation is collective and is communal. Now, I want to now jump to another subject here that is related to this, to say that when we look at society today, we find that our societies are absent of God. God has become a private matter in all faiths and religion. You will see yourselves as well when you go out to work in the corporate world, when you work outside, you hesitate to talk about religion and God, isn't it? Because people look at you funny. The moment you talk about God, they think of you as being a zealot or a crusader or a jihadist or somebody like that. You might be talking about the love of God, but it is no longer acceptable to talk about religion. On the other hand, there is, in this godless society, there is a lot of a sense of individualism, and science is considered to be God. There is a lot of faith in science and what it provides us and what it discovers. Now, for most people, religion now plays a very small role. A lot of people you will meet, for example, may have been born to Christian families, and they might tell you, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, or I don't follow organized religion. There is a history of how science came to be so important in our lives, and religion came to be so insignificant in human societies, and particularly in Western societies. There was a time when Muslims were the leaders in science. And then, as we said last night, because of their backwardness in thinking, refusal to learn foreign languages, refusal to use the printers to print their books, and so on, they were taken over by the Europeans, and the Europeans now became the masters of science and invention. In Europe, there was a history of the church persecuting scientists. You've all heard, for example, of the Roman Catholic Inquisition and so on. And eventually there was a backlash that led to this separation of church and state. There was a time when people always believed in God. And in fact, if you read the history of natural sciences, you will see that the early scientists in Europe were actually very religious people. Right? Nobody would normally pay you most people would not accept even any sum of money as wage to go out and stand in a lightning storm and fly a kite with a key just to, try out some scientific experiment. But a lot of these people who were inventing things, their motive was the same as that of the Muslim scientists. They wanted to prove the power of God. They wanted to prove what they found in the Bible. They wanted to prove through those scientific discoveries that God does exist. It is the opposite now, where scientists will use science and research to prove God does not exist. But the early scientists, particularly if you study the history of natural sciences, you will see their aim was to actually prove that actually there is God. Now, a lot of disillusionment with religion was because as science progressed, it constantly was comparing itself not to all the religions of the world, but specifically to Christianity. And ideas such as there was a physical God sitting up on the heavens, some old man with a big white beard looking down at the earth, or the idea of God taking a physical form and coming onto the earth, it seemed fantastic and unbelievable to most people as they progressed in science. Many scientists in the early days were risking their lives if they were to suggest that the earth was the center of the universe or that it was not flat and so on and so forth. As philosophers progressed as well, they were dwelling on subjects like epistemology, and they were asking questions like, what is knowledge? What is reality? What is the truth? Who am I? Do I even exist? How do I know I am real? And so on and so forth. And as they were doing this, they were asking, is there any reality beyond my senses. Now, there is a very interesting history of how these empiricists, the people who came to argue that we can only trust on what we observe and what we can prove through our senses, and they came to call themselves the positivists or the logical positivists. There is a whole history to this that goes back to 1920s and 1930s. There was a Vienna circle, and there was a group in Berlin, and they used to meet regularly, and they used to discuss, and they formed different rules of how things would be measured in science versus superstition, and so on and so forth. Now, the long and short of it was that science sought to argue that everything you believe in must have tangible proof. If I cannot understand or reproduce something in a lab, then it doesn't exist. And this proof should not be based on mere faith or belief, but on empirical proof and on sense perception. And of course, they discovered many things and many rules around which humans progressed. They discovered the cure to illnesses, they discovered new technologies, they discovered new machinery and new inventions. And so this started giving this impression to people that science was more useful than faith and religion. It delivered something tangible, whereas religion, particularly in Europe, seen through the lens of Christianity, was seen as something that merely promoted superstition and belief in fairies and miracles and so on. Right? Oftentimes, science would also disprove something that was held by the superstitious and the religious. So as an example, if a person had some form of mental health illness, the religious and the superstitious would talk about the person being possessed by the devil and jinn and so on and so forth. Science would come along and talk about autism and different forms of mental health issues and offer some sort of hope through which people can be helped. So the more this happened, the more religion fell out of value and favor in the eyes of people. Science was seen as being something positive, something constructive. Religion was seen as something backward. Now, this is Christianity. Now, in Europe at the time, from an Islamic perspective, the Quran was not trying to improve people's lives from a physical perspective. The Quran does have ayats where it mentions science, where it mentions signs of Allah, but the primary aim of the Quran and Hadith is not to talk about physical need. You will see the Quran talk about, for example, eat clean food, or observing tahara and purity, or the miraculousness and health benefit of honey, for example. These sort of things are mentioned in the Quran, but the focus is on spirituality and salvation. The idea in the Quran is to uphold justice, to help men fulfill a destiny that transcends this world. This is because, from an Islamic perspective, the existence of this world is temporary. And this existence is also an animalistic one, and it is a very short journey in compared to the ultimate journey of one gaining higher consciousness of one's creator. Now, besides that, Islam also holds the belief that whatever humans need for their whatever they need for their physical needs, they will discover themselves sooner or later. So given enough time, men will learn even how to go to space. Men will learn how to cure illnesses. So the Quran does not spend a lot of time telling humans how to go to space, or how to cure this illness or that illness, or how to build buildings and so on, because humans will learn this as they interact with their physical world. On the other hand, humans have no access of knowing the unseen world, that which is beyond their senses. So the Quran focuses on that which humans will not be able to discover through experiment and through observation and through testing and trial and so on and so forth. So the Quran now focuses, for example, on bringing a realization in human beings that there is a life after death. Or for example, that there is a spiritual existence and a soul you possess besides your physical existence. Or for example, that whatever actions you do in this world has a consequence on your soul. And these affect an eternal existence after you live a short life here for 6, 7, 8, 9 decades on this planet. Now, as I said, in the early days, Christianity was opposed to science, and anyone who suggested anything that opposed the Bible risked their life. And this gave rise to the idea that you cannot have both. You cannot have science and religion. You would have to choose. Either you be the religious kind who says the earth is flat and the earth is the center of the universe, or you be the scientific, blasphemous kind, the heretic who believes in science and does not believe in religion. And this gradually then gave emphasis to atheism and agnosticism. And people who weren't sure, they said, I'm agnostic. I'm not made up my mind. Does God exist or does he not exist? So I'll just leave it at that. It was easy to ignore religion because its relevance was not seen in people's daily lives. The church tried to recover in some degree by, for example, not talking about hellfire. If you look at the Bible, there are verses that talk about hellfire, but you will be hard-pressed today to find any church that on a Sunday will deliver a sermon and frighten people with hellfire. They will only talk about love, for example, of God, right? Now, people began asking questions when they were initially hearing of all these verses about hellfire. Now they were taking control in their hands, and instead of submitting to a higher power, they were challenging it and saying, for example, I don't like being threatened. What kind of a God is this that threatens me? If God says to me, you have to do this, otherwise I'll put you in the fire of hell, that's like a man putting a gun to my head and saying, you have to do this, otherwise I'll shoot you. Well, go ahead and shoot me, because what's the value of believing or doing something when I'm not convinced? You're merely forcing me to do it. So that sort of an attitude was taken, and it was now easier to be anti-religion. You just needed enough people to start saying this, to build enough support so that now you could publicly proclaim these sort of ideas. Islam, and particularly the madhab of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, had a different understanding. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam taught that Allah is the only reality, and man is in a constant journey towards this reality. Hellfire was not something that Allah picks you and puts you in the fire of hell. Rather, it was something that you end up in when you move away from complete consciousness of your Creator. It is a place where you feel complete absence and you have no consciousness of your God. In other words, your actions translate and transform into a reality in which your soul will then abide. Or to put it differently, it is in your hands and it is you who creates your heaven or your hell. So it is not Allah who punishes you. Allah, on the other hand, is constantly seeking to bring you towards Him and to give you higher consciousness and awareness of Himself, because that is where you will find a deep sense of tranquility, and that is where you will find inner peace and eternal bliss. And that is why you see now the Quran constantly saying, وَمَا ظَلَمُونَ وَلَكِنْ كَانُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ يَظْلِمُونَ. When they sinned and when they rebelled, it was not us that they were harming, but they were only harming themselves. And there are other verses of the Quran where Allah says, we will give you nothing but your actions back to you on the day of judgment. And we will say, this is what you did. So, unfortunately, this perspective of religion, this idea of God was not present. There are some groups in Muslims, such as the Wahhabis, who subscribe to an anthropomorphic idea of God, that God is a physical existence, that He is physical and every Thursday night He comes down and so on and so forth. But for the most part, Muslims do not believe in this idea of tajassum. Now here let me say something, that even though scientists and atheists in particular will give you the impression that they hold themselves very strictly to science and to not believing in anything without proof, the reality is that when you probe hard enough, you will see that they also are not as scientific as they make it out to be. And that people buy into it because they don't see an alternative, and they completely identify with their physical existence, so they think science is the new God. But if you probe hard enough, you will find that a lot of scientific, quote-unquote scientific evidence is actually based on faith. Perhaps I'm putting it too simplistically, but just this morning I was looking at an article that was saying, what is the difference between religious faith and scientific faith? And the person was trying hard to argue that scientists and atheists don't go along on the basis of faith. He said, well, religious faith is like when you as a Christian say that Jesus was born of a virgin birth, which is impossible. Or when you as a Muslim say that the Prophet Muhammad went up to the heavens on a horse that was winged, for example. He says there is no way for you to prove this. So it is just based on faith. But science, when they say the grass is green, they explain why it is green. When they say the stove is hot, they can explain why it is hot. Now, here there is a very unfair comparison, because these are very simple things that don't require tremendous amount of scientific proof. But supposing a scientist tells you things like, we found ice on a planet that is billions of light years away. You now believe this and you don't question it at all. When the Quran talks of a miracle, you say, I wonder if that actually happened. But a scientist tells you billions of light years away, we found ice on a planet, you don't even doubt it for a moment. Because we have all bought into this idea that science is right and everything else is not as accurate as science. A lot of scientific experiments is only based on studies and trials. So let us take an example. A scientist or a researcher will take a small segment of the human race, maybe 2,000 people, make them drink coffee for 6 months, and then conclude that coffee is very good for you. It is an antioxidant and it actually reduces heart disease. Now, of course, coffee is addictive as well. It's got caffeine, it's a drug. So there's all the more reason why I wouldn't want to question that. In fact, I wouldn't want to know more if this is potentially a lie, because this is exactly what I want to hear. But supposing now I start asking questions, who funded this research? Was it that coffee company? The one that makes millions by selling coffee, for example? And did you eliminate all external factors that could have interfered with the results of this study, such as the gender of the participants, their age, their medical history, their genetic disposition, the type of coffee you used, and so on and so forth? And they do admit that they try and eliminate all these factors, but there may be factors that they may not be aware of. So science, when it defends itself, what it says is, it says when we tell you something as a scientific truth, it's just a conjecture. It's our best guess at this point. And we are constantly experimenting again and again. And when we have a better conjecture, we will replace it with another guess that we think is better. And that will be the new scientific truth. And therefore, when I tell you as a scientist, this is the truth, I leave a door open to say I may be wrong. But if I correct it, you will have the same level of conviction on the new truth that that is true. And so I can go back and forth every day and tell you this month coffee is bad, next month coffee is good. This month eggs is bad, next month coffee is bad. This month orange juice is bad, next month is bad. But I'm constantly doing research and I'm allowed to do that conjecture. Religion, on the other hand, cannot do that, because religion argues that it is sacred and it is from God. So God cannot be experimenting. His knowledge has to be perfect. So if religion changes its mind, it is seen as the religion itself has a problem, and it is false. Now, consider as well, for example, the argument on Darwinism and evolution. A lot of people who are religious have been arguing for a long time, where is the fossil evidence? Have you ever seen any fossil evidence of a creature that was half this creature and half that creature that would prove evolution? They have their own arguments. I realize I'm putting it very simply here, but if you keep pushing and asking questions, you will come to a point where you will see that belief is also based on faith. It's not based on something concrete that is 100% sure. Or for example, when scientists will tell you there were these dinosaurs, and our kids all love dinosaurs, right? They'll tell you all these 30-letter names that I cannot even pronounce. But when you look at these dinosaurs, they have different structures, long necks, horns, and then they have very interesting colors. They have a blue and a green and a bit of red on the forehead and a bit of orange. And I used to wonder, they found the fossil and the skeletons. How did they know what colors these dinosaurs are? So I began looking into it. And I came to the conclusion that some of the things they discovered, like they'd see in the stomach some food leftovers, and through that they'd know if it was a carnivore or a herbivore and so on. But on color, they have some ideas through this and through that, but it's work in progress. But rest assured, if one of those dinosaurs was brought back to life, they might be surprised at how different it looks from what they predicted. But we never question it. We completely believe that. So I'm trying to show you that science in some ways also is based on guesswork and faith. And the Quran says this in chapter 6, verse 116. وَإِن تُطِيعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. If you were to follow and obey most of the people on the earth, they will lead you astray. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. They are only conjecturing. وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. It is only guesswork. Okay, so now we conclude from this that man has an animalistic side and man has a divine side, which I have previously described as tabi'ah and fitra. Now, as religion became less relevant and science became the new God, whose word was now unquestioned, humans now began asking that if there is no God and I'm here by accident, and when I die I simply disappear into oblivion, then what is the purpose of my existence? Do I have a purpose? Is there anything that I can call good or bad? From where do I have this sense of justice or sense of beauty or right or wrong? If everything evolved through time and everything evolved because there was a need for it, what caused the need for humans to have a sense of humor, for example, or a sense of justice, or a sense of beauty, or a sense of spirituality? So, despite knowing that this world is temporary, and I am just an animal, and I'm here by accident, why do I still crave immortality? How do you explain this through evolution and through Darwinism? Why do I still crave for perfection? If it was only a survival of the fittest that has brought us to this point, why are some humans selfless? You can understand a human being killing another one to dominate over him because that is survival of the fittest. It complies and agrees with the Darwinian theory. But when a human being is willing to cut his own body open and donate an organ or give blood, how do you prove that through Darwinism and evolution? That is completely contrary to the idea of survival of the fittest. Where did this notion and idea come into humans? So, if people were to obey, there is yet another example. Why do humans obey any laws in society? If we are here by accident, there is no God, there is no purpose in life, and when I die I go into oblivion, why should I obey the law? They say you should obey the law because that is the only way a civil society will exist. So for the good of the whole society, I agree to obey the law, you agree to obey the law, and as we obey the law, we can then have a society. So now we ask from that, if there is no good or bad, and we obey laws only to uphold civility in a society, is it okay for me to steal or to harm someone if I know I'll get away and it won't change society? Supposing I walk into Walmart and I sneak out a chocolate bar and I eat it without anybody seeing. It doesn't change anything, right? Because there is no accountability. Once I die, I disappear. It's oblivious. And how does that change society? And everybody starts thinking like that, and then it degenerates. Now, so humans now began feeling purposeless. Once they left religion, science became God. Science began promoting atheism. Now humans started feeling dejected, purposeless, depressed. Why should I even live? So now they turned their attention to their physical existence and to materialism and said, well, if I have to live out this purposeless life, I might as well enjoy myself and indulge in every fantasy and desire that I can. So now life became all about the pursuit of pleasure and wealth and comfort and luxury and wanting fame and controlling others so that I always have the upper hand. So now the God of humans changed once more. That science that was God was now replaced by a new God, and this new God was now my ego. Humans now began worshipping their own selves, their egoic selves. And now my idol was my nafs, myself, my lower base self. Interestingly, the Quran talks about this as well, in two places. And in Surah Jathiyah, chapter 45, verse 23, it says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ. Have you seen him whose lust is his God? Whose hawa, whose base desire is his ilah, is his God. You can go up and look at this verse further. I don't wish to go into the detail of explaining it. Now, Muslims, to no exception of other faiths, as soon as they were faced with this crisis of a society that is godless, they immediately broke into two groups. One, as we discussed yesterday, was the modernists, the Mu'tazilite types. The other was the fundamentalists, or the Ash'arite types. And these were the ones who saw everything black and white as us versus them, Muslims versus the rest, or versus the West. Now, I want to very quickly talk about these two groups, and I don't know if I will cover everything tonight, but if I don't, I will continue on Monday. The modernists said, well, these statements that are being thrown at us, like feminism, humanism, freedom, empirical proof, bioethics, and so on, are good points, and we need to address these. We must show we must show science that religion is actually better than science, and we can use the same arguments. So we are now going to start writing books to show that the Quran already talks about all these things, and that all the science discoveries and proofs you have, the Quran already talked about it before. But now there is a problem here. Science can change its opinion. So once you have argued that this scientific discovery is in the Quran, when science changes its opinion, then what do you say now about the Quran? Because now you are on the defensive, trying to prove something that you don't have to. Now, these modernists now were completely trying to align with the modern man that is godless, that is constantly bashing at religion. They now began saying that, well, we should only use the Quran as a guideline, but we should use our collective reasoning to identify the truth, so that we are still Muslims, but we conform to science and modernity. Let's interpret everything in Sharia as being relative, and the Quran is only a broad guideline, so that now I will define the intent and will of God, and I will say what the Quran is trying to say. Based on human rights, as Muslims, let's promote a vegan diet, for example. Based on equality, let's prove that Islam never wanted polygamy. Based on human rights, let us say that Islam never wanted us to fast more than X number of hours, because that is inhumane. Now that inhumane, you are defending it based on the understanding of someone who has a different belief system. And there was now a constant mantra that you hear nowadays that says, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. To the point that now, if it doesn't make sense, then don't follow it. Now, how can you say a mu'min is better than a kafir when the kafir is giving more charity than a mu'min? So we, in a sense, have disconnected ourselves from the sources, and now we are obsessed with trying to conform to these terminologies and values that have been imposed on us. How can a girl or boy be baligh at such a young age? It's not justice. Perhaps we got it wrong. So let's change our Sharia and our faith to conform to what society calls justice and humane. Allah says, لا يكلف الله النفس لا يكلف الله النفس إلا وسعها. Allah does not try a soul beyond its capacity. So we're going to use this as a principle, and now we are going to decide what is beyond our capacity and what is a burden and what is not a burden. So now we begin to say, I don't think my God would do this. My God does not allow this. The God that I worship does not say this. All these statements are true, but notice they are filled with the words my and I, my God, the God that I worship. So the question is, what is this God that you worship? Is it Allah or is it your ego? Because both could be the gods that you are referring to. And so we keep defining and redefining religion, and this now takes us on a slippery slope. And I will allude to this again on Monday when I talk about what I see as a prediction of where Islam will be in the West 20 years from now if we continue along this path. I want to summarize here and say that when we look at all these issues, the dangers of the reformists who are constantly trying to, for example, make faith acceptable based on terminologies that have been put forward by those who belong to another belief systems, as well as those who take on extreme ideas, basically swinging to this side versus swinging to that side. If you summarize the root of all these problems, there are 5 issues, and I want to mention them very quickly and then end. The first is that science and modernism has become religion for one group of reformists. The second is that blaming others and extremism has become Muslims' pet peeve, and now the leaning point for the other group, the revivalists or fundamentalists. The third thing we observe is this sense of inferiority complex. There is this deep-seated idea that we need the West in order to civilize ourselves. We cannot run our own schools. We cannot set up our own institutions. It is only the West that is civilized enough, and they and only they can teach us and educate us. We need European language, we need Western education, otherwise we are not seen as being civilized. So if you have a PhD in Urdu or Farsi or any other language, it doesn't seem to carry as much weight in our eyes. It has to be in a European language from a Western university. Even if that Western university has a school in the Middle East, we value sending our children to the West because our idea is that is the only place where you can find the quality of education. If a court in a Muslim country makes a decision, it's a kangaroo court. It has to be in the West before there is true justice that is given out. If someone speaks with an accent, then perhaps they are lesser educated and they're not as good as the person who speaks with the accent that is Western. Even if the person who speaks with an accent can speak 6 languages, whereas this person can only speak English. But these are remnants of colonialism that have stayed in the Muslim psyche, and it continues to stay there in that master-slave mindset. Kemal Atatürk of Turkey had tried this experiment. When he tried to modernize Turkey and force women to remove hijab and go out to work and remove Arabic script and replace it with a Latin script, and constantly trying to be part of the European Union even later, they never got what they want, and in the end there was only humiliation. خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. So there is this inferiority complex as well that we need to talk about. The other concern about Muslims today is that when Muslims talk about reform, they go through a process that I call veneer Islam, where everything is just superficial, outward, fake. There is no deep change in the ummah. There is an interesting article you will find about Pakistan if you go to the Dawn newspaper online. There is an article that says when Khuda became Allah. And there is this whole idea of how when the Saudis came to Pakistan, they began enforcing this way of how to become more Islamic. And the way you became more Islamic is you could no longer say Khuda Hafiz, you had to say Allah Hafiz. Why? Because Khuda was Persian, and Persians are of course not Muslims. So you now had to say Allah Hafiz. Of course, they forgot to emphasize that if you're going to say it in Arabic, then it is Allah Hafiz, not Allah Hafiz. But nonetheless, there was that push. And the article goes on to say that they went to all places in Pakistan to promote these ideas. And suddenly now Pakistan became Pakistan. And Punjab became Punjab. And the author begins to write this. He says, Punjab is made up of 2 words, Panj and Ab, 5 rivers, the land of 5 rivers. What is Punjab? But this became now the push. And now, I have never been to Pakistan, but apparently, depending on how a person says goodbye to you, you know exactly their religious leaning. If he says Khuda Hafiz, you know where he is. If he says Allah Hafiz, you know where he is. You say Allah Hafiz, you say, yeah, he's Wahhabi. Right? I don't oppose saying Allah Hafiz, of course, it is the name of God. But these are the kind of changes Muslims are thinking, that this is how we can be more Islamic. Shorten our clothes, grow our beards, right? And if you go online, we talked yesterday of Sar Sayyid. Sar Sayyid, he was knighted by the Queen. Look at his picture, you'll be amazed. Big cap, long beard, he looks like an Ayatollah, right? But he is Sar Sayyid. On the opposite, look at Sayyid Qutb. You will see a man with a suit and tie, clean shaven and completely westernized until his later life. So these are the kind of things that Muslims are struggling with. And then finally, religion has become free for all. And this will be a big part of my conclusion on Monday. I will draw parallels and show you that just like Judaism split and became Orthodox Jews versus the more modern liberal Jews, and Christianity gave up the laws of Moses and became a religion that spoke of goodness without Sharia, if Muslims continue the way they continue, they will end up in the same state. And history will begin repeating itself. What we want to say in conclusion is that Islam is not against the intellect and the use of the intellect, and inshallah on Monday I will show you the evidence of this, that the path of the Ahlul Bayt is not one where you just take the Quran and you forsake aql. But Quran is primary and aql does not oppose Quran, but you hold both hand in hand. And what I will argue is that the dangers we face today and the solution to our problems as Muslims living in the West is that we have now adopted a policy where we feel we can cut ourselves loose from the ulama, the rightful traditional ulama, and we can figure things out ourselves going forward. And the solution is first to identify the qualities of the ulama that deserve to be followed, and then to show some subservience to them. Because what is happening is this sense of individualism where I want the opinion of everyone, but I am going to decide with help from Google what is right and what is wrong, and what I should do and what I shouldn't do on this issue. And this is in particular an issue that is plaguing societies in the West. And there are some examples that may be particularly relevant to us in Toronto as well, and particularly for the community whose ethnicity I belong to, the Khoja community. And so I want to, again, in the same manner of being respectful but candid, criticize some of the attitudes that we have as a community that is leading us away from Orthodox Islam. And that we need to regain and re-understand the value of what we have in terms of adala, imama, and that we have something very precious in our hands, that direct connection to imama through the tradition of the ulama. And the idea that we do not wish to be patronized, and that we as Khojas have lived for centuries in Africa with our own people and our own local mullahs, and we have fared pretty well, and therefore we can take it from here on our own, is a dangerous idea. So there are people who don't have gold and have to go out looking for it, but there are people who are sitting on gold and they don't know they're sitting on it. The case of the Shia is the later, and that's what I wish to, inshallah, highlight and present in whatever time I will have, inshallah, on Monday when I make a conclusion to this subject. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad. One more salawat ala Muhammad. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة وباب نجاة الأمة لعن الله ظالمين لكم من الأولين والآخرين ما خاب والله من تمسك بكم وأمنا من لجأ إليكم فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. ليلة عاشوراء، ليلة مصيبة. Tonight and tomorrow night there is a qiyamah in the house of Zahra alayhi salam.